Hi, everyone. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson, Director at the Center for Political Education from the Ohlone Lands in the so-called East Bay of California. And on behalf of CPE, W.E. Du Bois, Abolition School, and Haymarket Books, welcome to the first online event to launch this week's release of Civil Rights and Structural Attacks, Conversations with Walter Riley, published by our friends at AK Press. Not only are we marking the special occasion of this book's release, but it just so happens to be Father's Day, and all of us here just so happen to be fathers working to build a stronger social movement left for our kids and for a new generation of organizers and activists. That includes Walter himself, the father of the visionary director and artist Boots Riley, and Jesse Strauss, who just became a father this week. Congrats, Jesse. They will both be in conversation with a dear, dear friend of CPE and Abolition School and a longtime friend of Walter Riley, the esteemed movement scholar and author Robin D.G. Kelley. Before we start, a little bit more about Walter and Jesse, who together crafted this book. If you're not already familiar with Walter Riley, he's a legend. He grew up as a civil rights activist in the Jim Crow South, chairing Durham, North Carolina's young adult NAACP and organizing voter registration, sit-ins, and job campaigns. He was a field secretary for CORE in the Southeast region, and when he moved to the Bay Area, he became a San Francisco State University activist for ethnic studies and was a member of the Black Student Union and Students for a Democratic Society. Walter has been a mainstay in the Bay Area progressive legal community, working as a criminal defense and civil rights lawyer since the 1980s. And he's not only a loving father, but also a grandfather. So we welcome Walter. And Jesse is an anti-imperialist and abolitionist cultural worker, community organizer, musician, and journalist born and raised in Oakland and Berkeley. He's an anti-Zionist descendant of Jewish survivors of the Nazi genocide and was raised by parents engaged in radical queer healthcare and immigration asylum access work in the Bay Area. As a journalist, he worked with KPFA Radio, and he has been working with them for many years, where he co-created the first ever daily abolitionist radio show, Law and Disorder. He was also a producer for Al Jazeera during the Arab Spring and Occupy movements, and at CP, we worked together with Jesse in his role as the program director for La Peña Cultural Center in Berkeley. Representing different experiences and periods of social movement activism, Jesse and Walter have put together a multi-generational discussion on the importance of political action and a deep reflection on Walter's 80 years of experience in the Black freedom struggle, labor movements, and internationalism. This book is endorsed by other movement scholars and strategists like Vijay Prashad, Barbara Ransby, Bill Ayers, and Robin himself, who believes you will, quote, find in these pages the critical insight, wisdom, and direction organizers need to meet the moment. We're honored to have them and to have Robin as our interlocutor today. A reminder, you can purchase a copy of this book online by visiting AK Press at akpress.org. And finally, CP and W. Du Bois Abolition School are close comrades working together to help the left interpret the world so we can change it. And I encourage you to learn more about our work by visiting politicaleducation.org or abolitionschool.org or our social media pages, and to support our work through your donations. You can also check out sessions that we'll be doing together at the Socialism Conference in September. And you saw an ad for that just a little while ago. Before we start, I'm pleased to introduce my dear comrade, the coordinator of Abolition School, Gio Mayer, who's going to provide a little bit more context for this book and its importance to social movements in this moment. Thanks, Gio.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this call, and thanks to Haymarket for hosting it. This is a continuation of, as Thomas mentioned, an ongoing political education collaboration that's seeking to build really a foundation for doing political education in such pressing times on a nationwide and global scale. And so I'm incredibly excited to be here and to be here on Father's Day. As Thomas mentioned, we're all fathers, some sort of long-standing fathers, others very, very new. And I don't think that's incidental to what it is that we're talking about, because we're talking about the work of intergenerational knowledge dissemination, the sharing of wisdom, the sharing of insight, and the using of that insight to build stronger movements for the future. And I think that's crucial to the work that needs to be done today to build the intergenerational movements that will be able to weather this sort of time of monsters that we confront. But also, when I, so for example, look back as a sort of quickly aging, person, and think about, the way that I think about the present. I look at the present through, the lens of an arc of a few decades. And that's the way that I sort of begin to develop and, bring together a series of understandings and ideas and frameworks that allow me to think about those questions. And what's very interesting and what is a tremendous honor about this event in particular is that for me, a central piece of that trajectory is precisely the experience of Oakland, California during the Oscar Grant rebellions and the many mobilizations that shook the Bay Area starting in 2009, but continuing, right? The truly seismic impact of that. And I'm absolutely certain that Comrade Walter Riley doesn't remember this, but the first time that I, encountered and met him was in Oakland in the courthouse, where he and other lawyers were coming together to strategize a way to defend those who had been arrested during the rebellions, myself included. And that's really, I think, a testament to the steadfastness with which, Walter approaches ongoing struggles, the very innate understanding that he has of what it means to be a truly movement geared lawyer, someone who understands the role of movements and understands the role of lawyers in supporting those movements and defending the those who are on the front line. um, and it was in that context as well that I met, of course, Jesse as well, right? And so to be here on this call for me is a tremendous honor, and to be able to join you all in thinking through, our contemporary moment, not through the relatively short arc that I have at my disposal, but through a much longer arc, through the sort of archive and reservoir of experiences that are going to be shared by Walter, by Robin, and everyone else in this conversation. And so with that, and with that sort of really, truly tremendous honor and pleasure, I'm going to hand it off to a dear comrade, Robin D.G. Kelley.
Thank you, Gio. I think the honor is bigger for me just to be with all of you on this particular day. And I appreciate all your words, Gio, and all the work that you put into it. Also, let me just acknowledge one thing before we begin. Um, Walter Riley is the father of extraordinary kids. All his kids are amazing, and his grandkids. One I've had the pleasure of teaching at UCLA, the other one I've had the pleasure of talking to and learning from, who's at Brown University. So I just want to acknowledge that, not to mention all of your political children. I include myself, in that category. So let me say something about the book before we get started. I had the honor of reading, a draft of it early on, and despite the fact that uh, Walter, you've been involved in virtually every single campaign and organization over the last half century that actually made a difference, from NACP and CORE to Progressive Labor Party, through doing labor, fair housing advocacy, tenants' rights, welfare rights, anti-Klan organizing, Central American solidarity, anti-apartheid. We can go on and on and on. One of the things that struck me about the book, I kept thinking to myself, why is Walter Riley's story so unorthodox, given the fact that you're in all the major places? And I couldn't put my finger on it until I realized there were two things. One, you decentered yourself, which is not common among a lot of like memoirs. It really wasn't about you, though you were there. Uh, Secondly, you were honest, which is also not common. I mean, it's the most truthful, honest, humble book I think I've ever read, and that says a lot, having read a lot of books. So I want to begin just by asking both you and Jesse how you came about writing this book. I mean, it's very unusual. It's a conversation, set of conversations, not your typical memoir. But what's the genesis of the book?
Thank you, Robin. I'm going to pass to Jesse because he's the one who initiated this.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you, Gio and Thomas, for introducing us. It's a real honor to be in this conversation with all of you. Um, Gio started the conversation mentioning when we first met, which was also around the same time that I met Walter, which was in during the timing of the rebellions that took place in Oakland in response to the police murder of Oscar Grant. For folks who don't know or aren't aware, I'll try to be very brief, but Oscar Grant was a young man, actually a father, as we're celebrating Father's Day, who was killed by BART, the subway police department in Oakland on January 1st, 2009, in the kind of immediate response. Community members uprose in the streets in anger. It was kind of one of the first in our more modern era of police killings caught on video that went viral over social media. And so people were seeing this, obviously reminiscent of the Rodney King beating, but in a different era. Over a few weeks in those early days, people went to the streets, took to the streets, and protested in a wide variety of methods. And over the ongoing trial that took place over the following year and a half, those protests took a variety of strategies, tactics, and also formed kind of very specific different groupings within the Oakland political sphere. The first time I had actually seen Walter, and I had heard of Walter in a community before, but the first time I actually saw Walter was being arrested outside his own office on July 8th, 2010, which was the night of the verdict against the officer who killed Oscar Grant. I was interviewing someone on the street for KPFA, and someone pointed over and said, "Who is that gentleman being arrested in a suit?" And I later learned that that was Walter. But as an organizer in these spaces, I was very much struggling with the kind of divisiveness and sectarianism that different organizing groups were dealing with. And right after that date that I first saw Walter, he penned a public letter that I'm gonna just read a few sentences from that landed and kind of impacts how this book came to be. So he wrote, "I do not like this divisive campaign to divide our community and protesters by calling people outsiders. Oakland is not an isolated town in the desert. This is a great metropolitan area with people from all over. With a world-class university, we expect people from all over the map to participate in Oakland. Calling people outsiders in this instance is a political attack on the movement. The subtext is that the outsiders are white and not connected to Oakland. From the days of the civil rights movement to now, the outsider labeling failed to address the underlying problems for which people came together." And so some comrades of mine and I approached Walter to try to get involved in kind of mediating some conversations between different sectarian groups, people who were calling each other out, some folks who were calling some other folks out for participating in protests in ways that some people didn't like. But some of that complaint was very public, rather than addressing questions within the movement or trying to build relationships. Some of those folks were expressing things publicly in a way that was dividing the movement and really trying to shut things down. We approached Walter because he was so clear in his framework, challenging this kind of outside agitator framework, thinking of what does it mean for people to have shared investment in a political framework. Not necessarily that everyone has to agree on a tactic, but what does it mean to agree on the motivating factor and encourage and engage a movement from that? And since then, it's been about 15, 16 years now that I've known and organized with Walter off and on. And it's been an incredible thing to be aware of that original start point to our relationship as part of a long-standing thread that I've learned throughout his life, being involved in challenging the narrative of outside agitators, even during the civil rights movement, when Freedom Rides and Freedom Highways Project were coming to Durham, North Carolina, where he was from. So I approached Walter to work on this project specifically because of the ways that he's insisted over the years that I've known him, and of course for many more before that, to engage in movement building rather than movement complaining, which is a lot of what we kind of see in our movement ecosystem in Oakland, which is where we both live. And I wanted to try to understand where that came from for him, because a lot of the movement elders that I've interacted with have taught lots of lessons, and I've learned lots, and also engage in very particular communities and in very particular orientations, are very set in their ways. And every time I've organized with Walter, it's coming with a sense of curiosity and a sense of it's like there's no ego in working with Walter. Walter uh, is curious just like all of us, and understands that while we may be motivated by similar things, uh, we don't necessarily have the answers of how to organize. And what we need to do is engage from the same motivation of horrific impacts of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and try to build a movement. So this book, it is not a memoir, as Robin mentioned. It's a little different than most people's kind of oral histories, because the framing and the purpose of it is to build lessons from Walter's engagement in political movement. So in it, I'm sure we'll have many more questions about the details, but we'll talk about civil rights movement. We'll talk about anti-apartheid movement. We'll talk about anti-police violence movement, et cetera.
You're on silence.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, good. Yes, thing keeps cutting off. So yeah, thanks, Jesse. That was really helpful context. And I want to, in addition to some of the themes you brought up, one we're going to come back to, that is the importance of Oakland. But what I want to ask you about, Walter, is the importance of North Carolina, of Durham. Oakland is a theme that comes up over and over again in your conversations. But you came up in Durham, which has its own unique political culture. This is where you came to politics. Can you talk about what's unique about North Carolina and how it shaped your development as an organizer and as a thinker?
Yeah, I think that's particularly important, understanding the history of its Durham. I come from a family that were tenant farmers. My dad's relatives, my mom relatives were tenant farmers. This is where they had lived when our ancestors were enslaved. So it's not very far away from everything. So that's a constant presence of that history that's there. And the Jim Crow South made it impossible for you to forget it, that it exists. So the struggle for survival, the struggle for life and family was just a part of understanding the world around us and how to navigate it. Durham is also unique in that it had tobacco factories in addition to the tobacco farmers, but the factories where industrial workers were able to gather, build unions, or build support for each other through solidarity in various ways. Many things to read about the factory workers union and the separation between the black factory workers and the white factory workers, and what that meant in the South, what it meant in Durham, and some great leaders that came from that. One of the other people that came from Durham is Polly Murray, who is the person that RBG fashioned her approach out of, and Polly Murray actually developed the theories, political approach, and practice that RBG became famous for. Polly Murray being a black woman who was also gay, and after many years became a leader in religious affiliations. Some of that history is what we all were aware of, but coming from the country, coming from a smaller, what I know now as a village, which was Bragtown, uh, I was aware of our relationship to the greater white community. I was aware of our relationship to the city of Durham. And I was also aware of the fact that coming from the kind of background of being farmers, there was a difference between us and the black bourgeoisie, which is important when people are organizing in community organizations and studying. Need to be aware that there are issues there. There's certainly many things that people can read. I'm sure if you ask Robin, he could give you a long list of things to read with regard to that. Within that movement of black workers in Durham and farmers and people who were doing well, Durham had the largest black-owned business in the world, which was North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company in the 50s and so forth. It had banks. Um, but we still had black racism and oppression. And we had some very large churches. For anybody that has followed the religious, Daddy Grace was based out of Durham at one point. Uh, so that was part of the history that I was in. I was part of growing up in a family, a large family that had a certain sense of dignity, both as when they were farmers and when my dad went into construction work and was able to finally buy a house and get away from being a tenant farmer. Or that was important to us. Going to school, I was the second in my family to graduate high school. My brother, 2 years older than me. Out of 11 children, I was number nine. My parents thought it was important for us to go to school, so we fought for that. I was aware that there was racism very early on. Going to an all black school from first to the 12th grade, being in a community of all black people, being in a community of people that had some sense of themselves. And we had fun together. We had joy. You know, we had parties. We had baseball teams. We were paying attention to everybody on the national scene. We were aware of the Suez Canal. We were aware of Ralph Bunche. We were aware of Jackie Robinson. We were aware of Paul Robeson too. And certainly um, a few years later, I was aware of Marion Anderson because we were black folk, conscious as black folk, and we had our own religious organizations, and we wanted to understand each other. So that was important to me politically to be involved in, for me to be involved in that. And as you remember, and everybody will remember now, that Emmett Till was murdered in front of the world uh, in the 50s, and Emmett Till and I weren't that different in age. He was from Chicago, and I was from the South, and I knew what he had faced, and I knew what others had faced, and other people in and around me had dealt with some of those same kinds of things. So I was just involved in developing. I was a reader, which was very important. And as a reader, I became aware of a bigger world. And as the movement developed in the later 50s, I want people to remember that Mac Parker was hanged on television. That was the beginning of television. Mac Parker was taken out of his jail by a mob, lynch mob, and killed for supposedly raping a white woman. That had a tremendous impact on me. I still visualize the crowd scenes from the television, black and white TV. And the FBI and the law enforcement said they couldn't find anybody that was involved. And we could see hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, who were involved in the march to take him to lynch him. That made me very concerned for what could happen to me and my kind, and it made me want to do something more. So maybe, Robin, I've forgotten the question, but
Oh,
it reminded me of what was the sentiment that I grew up
right.
with and how I got involved.
Yeah, no, that is the answer to the question. And one of the things that, a couple of things that you mentioned that I think is so important. One is that you're a reader on the one hand. On the other hand, you didn't have to read a book to understand class relations. When you talk about, witnessing the differences between growing up as a sharecropper versus, owning a major insurance company, and that those class relations are very important in terms of your outlook. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is extremely important, which is consistent throughout your story in the story of Black struggle, is the importance of anti-violence, of trying to deal with racist violence, which is also a form of class violence. Um, so I really appreciated this story. And I want to turn to a couple of things, in that story you told, and also in your whole trajectory, we can read several lessons that you give us. You give movements. One, the need for real unity on the left. Two, the need to have deep connections to communities that we organize, organic connections. Uh, Three, the need to embrace serious criticism and self-criticism. And four, the need to have theory, but not to be myopic in the sense that, you know, we just decide that the theory is going to define our politics as opposed to actual work itself. And I'm wondering, given those key lessons, what what did you take from those formative experiences and in moving to the Bay Area to organize? What were the key lessons that you figured out, that you kind of figured out, like in struggle? If you can give us a couple of examples of how you came to
Yeah.
these conclusions.
Well, I was very aware from the very moment as an adolescent joining the civil rights movement that I was not a member of the black middle class. Um, you get treated differently if you come from the black working class, or what may be called the very underclass, and particularly for tenant farmers, we were not at the top of the social scale. Even now, Robin, you know that when people write about the civil rights movement, more often there's a sense of lifting up the upper middle class black folk. And if you go to the museum now, the working class communities, which was the largest number of communities in the Southeast region of people being involved, are not lifted up as the organizers, activists, and so forth. And it's just something we have to understand. But I took from that period that building and being part of group, mass organizing, and more people being involved was very important, which later I learned to call base building, knowing the people around, having the support, which I did in my community, having support of my family because they knew what I was doing, even though it was dangerous for them, and other people in the community giving support. Wanting to have more people actively giving support and trying to figure out how that could happen was a part of being in the civil rights movement. Doing voter registration or organizing or getting support when we're trying to desegregate facilities, it needed to have as many people supporting as possible. A boycott doesn't work if people don't support it. And if it's just performance where you make a speech and say you're doing something and go get funding for it, it doesn't necessarily make changes. And that's what we were trying to deal with in those days. The organizations that I worked with wanted to have more massive support for protection, but the communities, remember, were very separated. So the urban area of black folk was very separated from the North Durham area that I grew up in by large white communities, and some of which we weren't even allowed to go on the streets in. And we had to work out ways of working together from one school to the other, from one neighborhood to the other, or from one bus to the other. Racism was very prevalent in all of our lives. Um, Durham, just an aside, is one of the places that make me remember that in the 40s, a black soldier came home from the war and refused to accept the bus driver's admonition that he couldn't sit where he wanted to sit. I think that's in the book. And the bus driver shot him in the back. That was Durham in the late 40s. That's a place where police arrested folks for eyeballing, claiming in one case that a cop says he saw this Negro's eyes pop out of his head and around the corner to peer at this white woman. And those are the kind of things they would take to court. That's how ridiculous it is. And people have to understand that as much as we hear crazy things today, they were very crazy then, and people accepted that. So I had the idea myself that I couldn't be involved in getting things done if I was not connected with other folks. And that was an aspect of being in the church that we were in, being in the neighborhood where we wanted more active support, being in a community where not everybody agreed that we had to challenge the racism in the manner that we had to fight with folks in those days. Remember, in the late 50s, a lot of the churches were not ready to challenge the Jim Crow system. A lot of the ministers were not ready, and particularly if they were in organizations. Many of the black churches also were an adjunct to a white church. And the white churches, of course, was not going to support black congregations being involved. The Baptist and AME churches, AME being the most progressive at the time in terms of freedom and so forth, was not necessarily supporting young people being active. They themselves were very active and a lot of outstanding leaders in the AME communities. But young people who were not connected to them were not trained. We were not building that group for my age group at that time. And my age group was ready to move forward from, as I mentioned, Emmett Till, from all the other things we saw, from all the people who had come home from Korea that were young in the late 50s, early 50s and mid 50s. They were young folk, and so they could relate to us. And people coming home with their injuries and their PTSD. That wasn't called that at that time. It was just called shell shock. And we knew what it was, that they were damaged forever from being in a war that was fought around other issues that did not necessarily help them to liberate themselves. So I think we understood that. The question becomes how then you build the mass movement. And we didn't learn enough about building a mass movement because the major aspects of the organizations we were in were fighting to build organization, and building organization was not always consistent with building a mass movement. That needs to be discussed a lot more and probably has been. I just haven't seen it. But the NAA was a large organization, had a lot of members, but didn't recruit members in the farming communities, didn't recruit members in, the more depressed housing areas or in the projects around. Most of this membership was a different social economic group and included workers. We needed to have more than that, and we could not rely upon the people who were settled in the good jobs to work with us at all times. So we had to figure out how to reach them, how to talk to them, how to organize with them. And when I came out to California, I was still a field secretary for Corps at the time, but I left North Carolina because I was married with a child and I needed to make a living. Couldn't make a living there. And there was a promise of jobs and a promise of going to school here. And out here, I also learned that we had the same issues. Corps was dealing with trying to have mass movement, trying to have large numbers of people participating. Corps was involved and had been involved in the auto road demonstrations, etc. And my thought was coming here that there were not enough nitty gritty issues being raised in the civil rights movements about jobs, activities, and lifestyles. They seem to have more of a PR kind of approach to them. And that was something that required political discussion, reaching out to folks in neighborhoods to see what is it they think about this, what do they want to do. And this is also at the time that we had this mass upheaval with Africa. Remember, we were all aware that there was a liberation movement in Africa. We were aware that there was a liberation movement in Cuba, and Castro was claiming, Afro-Cuban society, communities, consciousness that had some meaning. And we were aware of the role that the U.S. was playing in South Africa, not just the Congo to some extent. So that was important. That was important for developing world outlook, and that only becomes useful if you can reach out to people and people talk about it and know what it means to build large solidarity was a major aspect of things that I learned coming here.
Yeah, that's like lesson number 5 or 6. You say specifically, we need an international movement. Um, can I go back and talk? Let's talk about what it means to build a mass movement, because you made some extraordinary choices. One is, you went to school. You could have easily become part of the Black bourgeoisie very early on, but you made a choice to stay literally in the working class, to drive a bus. Then you join the Progressive Labor Party and organize working people um, all over Detroit, Chicago, certainly in the Bay Area and elsewhere. Can you talk about the lessons you learned about trying to build mass movements through Progressive Labor Party? What might have been some of the missteps? What might have been the opportunities? uh, what were the key lessons in that, number one? And also, if you could really talk about Detroit. I mean, this is just selfish on my part, but I'm obsessed with Detroit and the fact that you were working with Barbara Ransby when she was still in high school, and I'm always giving her a hard time about that. But Detroit was special. I mean, Detroit. You come to Detroit at the tail end of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, when the Black Workers Congress was emergent. I mean, there's so much going on, and then you're a leader in PL. Could you talk about some of that?
Yeah, remind me of the other areas since we're talking about Detroit. I got to
Yeah,
Detroit in the end of '72, and I was I was the PL Central Committee member, leader in the organization, organizing there, and was responsible for bringing together people for political organizing around the Midwest region, which includes Chicago and west of Chicago, included the Rust Belt, contacting folks that were in steel, where there had been some tremendous organizing for a long time. And after working in an auto factory in Chicago, I went to Detroit, where we were building movement organizations within the plant. And one of the things that helped to guide us in those discussions were about building mass support. Some of the songs that came out of the Flint sit down, for people who are talking about building movement, just be aware that there was a thing called the Flint sit down movement, where before the modern New Left movement, there was the movement for people to organize, and the struggles around building trade unions and building massive unions was a discussion. So we were having these discussions about how to build mass support in the movement. The League of Revolutionary Workers had done a lot building plant organizations. That was something to learn from and still to be learned from. Going into plants and building caucuses. I'd done some caucus building at the Muni. Before the Muni, I had worked as a lineman and a splicer for the telephone company in San Francisco. But building the caucuses required talking to people about workers' ideas, workers' needs, on the job struggles. And the big discussion at that time was, how do we build movement on the job that's beyond the wage and hour issue? Um, that is, we need to do more than just talk about we need to get better wages. We need to talk about the communities that we live in. And talking about the communities that we live in, if you're an auto worker or steel worker who has a job, has a decent job and good income, and you're working with folks that have power because they're at the point of production, people can begin to understand what their neighborhood might mean if they were to play a role in giving leadership to the neighborhood that they live in. Whether they can fight the police activities on the street, whether they can fight the gang organizing that was on the street, how to deal with that. Where does the gang organizing come from? One of the things that perhaps we didn't discuss in the book, but Chicago had the Stones, and they got a lot of money from the police across the country. They admitted to be disruptive and caused a lot of problems. You couldn't do organizing in Chicago or Detroit without being aware of that. Um, Coleman Young, with somewhat of a left background, ran for mayor in the early 70s in Detroit, an ex-military man who had led and organized black folks in the military had to run against a racist police chief who would pull out his gun and lay it on the table when they were having panel discussions. And Coleman Young got to the point where he'd pull his gun out and lay it on the table at the same time, as a sense of, you know, we're going to fight back. We're going to be here. We're going to make a change. And that was part of what Detroit was about. And because there had been this workers' movement that started in the 30s and went into the 40s, the movement that had an impact of organizing workers. And of course, the Communist Party had been a major aspect of that, in addition to the other socialist organizations. We have to know all this history sometimes to understand where we are, how we get here to where we are at this point. That's why education becomes so important in politics also. But by the time I was in Detroit, we had the Fred Hampton had already been murdered, notoriously and openly. We were aware of that, an impact that was like hit the communities like the murder of Emmett Till in many ways, but with a different level of political understanding after the Panthers. And organizing in Detroit meant that we have to understand the role of black folk playing a role in a part in giving leadership and in the communities. And we had to understand what it meant to build solidarity with other groups around the country, even in some sense of what was happening around the world. So that a group that was organizing folks in a factory needed to see itself and win people from the neighborhoods to give support to be a part of, particularly if there was an action at the place, at the work site. You needed all of that to win, and that was part of the lessons that the people at the Flint sit down had learned. And when you look at this, give me bread, give me roses, uh, give me these songs that helped to build the Flint sit down movement that can be learned from, that is being changed today. What that history is. That was something that was part of being bigger movement. PL was part of closing down the Mack Avenue stamping plant because one of its members, Bill Gilbert, uh, was being fired. And Bill and his friends on the shop floor said, I'm not moving. This is my job. This is not yours. This does not belong to you because you own this factory. This does not belong to you because you have the power in government to determine who has property and who doesn't. My job is my property. My job is my community. My people are the people in this plant. And 35,000 people sat down with him. And we controlled that plant for a significant amount of time. And outside the plant, people built at every plant door, every plant gate, built, it was in the wintertime, built fires and had meetings, and community came in and gave food to the people who were striking, who held the plant. That's, was the basis of our sense that we have to build community support. Base building is not done very well at all times. We didn't have enough understanding of putting more people on the streets and knocking on doors. In the neighborhood, we knocked on doors immediately around the plants. Also, these plants were built in working class communities, black and white communities, mostly black communities by the 70s. And because of all a number of things, the industrial pollution, et cetera, that's who was living in those places. So there was some sense of unity with that. We didn't have enough working together. The drum folks had their actions, and it was basically them. PL folks had their actions, so basically them. The SWP people had their actions, so basically them. Some community organizations had their actions. The Unfortunately, a number of the skilled trade groups were run by the CP, and they wanted only white workers in their organizations. That's a major aspect of the skilled trades in auto. And to this day, it still has an impact that the skilled trades didn't deal with class issues well enough, did not deal with building broader support, and dealt more with their own internal approach towards organizing and getting better jobs. One of the things that Walter Reuther said, the leader of the UAW, said he can beat anybody on bread and butter issues. And he was able to do that because the progressive labor movement small p and L, did not take on the class conscious approach of reaching out to folks and building the idea of working class unity, union membership, union organization being a community organizing approach. We were too much involved in the earlier days in trying to be uh, organized communism without building a sense of what it meant to make social change and social order. And I think that was a shortcoming for the earlier period movement before I got involved, and certainly an aspect of what was going on in the 60s and 70s. The left was building left organizations. PL was trying to build grassroots, and some of the other people were talking about base building, but not enough of an understanding, even to this day. Base building has something more to do than just knocking on the door, but having the approach. Um, One of the things that reminds me of it for folks is that Raymond Boots often talks about where he grew up with the parties in our house and that there were parties, which is an aspect of being in community, having some sense of identity with the people around us. But we had parties, we had political discussion, we had card parties, we had dances in the house, and that's where he learned the sense of a certain joy in building movement. But when you have that on a street block, it's pretty hard for somebody to come and attack you. When you have that on your job, it's pretty hard for you to be just destroyed. Nowadays, we have small fights when we get fired, but we should shut this a lot down under these attacks, whether it's schools, um, whether it's working in the medical facility where the discrimination is outrageous. Something that relates to the changes that social order that can make for a better lifestyle, better world, and moving towards systemic change in our society. Fundamental change requires having more friends, more political discussion, more organizational structure than we have now.
Right. That's so important, especially having friends who are not just on the internet.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that's sort of beautiful about the history of Oakland, and Oakland again is a theme that comes up, is the extent to which there has been, a tradition of community relationships, not just organizing, but where people actually do have a kind of public and community presence. And one of the things that struck me, in the book, is at one point, you and Jesse are talking, and you mentioned Oakland as possibly like the Oakland commune, similar to the Paris commune, and the possibilities of Oakland as a really unique place. And I remember reading in Elaine Brown's book, she kind of had this vision of electoral politics as possibly creating, turning Oakland into a kind of revolutionary city, even more so. And I'm wondering, before we go into the question, just my last question really combines those two issues. That is, what is Oakland? What is the potential for Oakland? And this is for both you and Jesse. And then also, what is the potential of this thing we call electoral politics? I mean, this is an issue that comes up in the book, and you have a very serious conversation about it, not just a surface level conversation, but a really deep conversation about what it means to kind of enter into, have a relationship with the electoral sphere. And of course, you're having this conversation right before Trump is elected, the second time. So, can you talk about those two things, like the meaning of Oakland possibility, and also the meaning and possibility or limits of electoral politics? And then we'll open up for questions.
Jesse.
Sure. I think this question, I'm going to take those two questions backwards. I think this question about electoral politics and the possibilities there is a really important conversation in the book, particularly because it uh, engages one of the few points in the book where Walter and I have we have a different approach. You know, I think what it has come down to since we've written this book and kind of been reflecting on it together is that we often find in movement building spaces that our organizations or also unaffiliated activists are identifying with organizing tactic. People will be, for example, completely focused on electoral organizing and electoral issues, or some of our radical comrades are completely focused on street protest or fomenting street rebellion, things like that. And often, and this goes back to the conversation around how Walter and I met, it's hard to bridge the gap of like, what does it mean for us to build unity among people who are focused on different organizing tactics? Um, and you know, what comes clear and apparent in Walter's stories is that there's no organizing, well, no one organizing tactic that gets us there. Um, you know, uh, we also, of course, in Oakland have the privilege in electoral context of not having the same kind of uh, electoral political challenges that happen, for example, in the U.S. South or in red states, and so we have people who are engaged in direct action and rebellious protest who are absolutely opposed to participating in the electoral system. And you know, I think that looks different geographically in terms of how we think of it. But I think more than anything else, uh, what's important in this conversation with Walter and I is that we can explore electoral politics not on an island. That anything that has moved in the various movements that Walter's been involved with since civil rights movement and many others, anything that has moved in the halls of power have been impacted and pushed by what's happening in the streets, both in grassroots organizing and base building, and also in rebellion and uprising. Um, and so while, you know, Walter and I approach and struggle with a little bit differently electoral organizing, we both are very clear that participation is vital. Um, you know, the book is called Civil Rights and Structural Attacks, and I just want to briefly mention like the purpose of calling it the structural attack portion is thinking about organizing framework that we can think of what it takes to build movement as attacking systems, a structural attack against systems. And, you know, Walter first brings this up in the conversation around protests against the Jim Crow apartheid system. And it's a particular system that that we hear in the civil rights movement about all kind of protest tactics that include, you know, lunch counter sit-ins or protests for jobs. And Walter's very clear that those are attacks on a structure, and that in order to make movement move us forward, and not at all saying that halls of power are what reflect successes in movement, but movements on the streets do push halls of power. Um, that in order to push movement success, an analysis that we're suggesting is trying to organize our efforts around what it means to create an attack against the structure that's challenging us. Structures change over time a little bit. Jim Crow apartheid is somewhat different now, of course, but white supremacist capitalism is a through line. And that, you know, bring back to your other question, like runs strong and clear in Oakland. Oakland is unique in a variety of ways. It is, you know, in casual conversation referred to as the town, and it's referred to as the town because people know each other. It's a city that, you know, I'm honored to be from, and as I've been in different parts of the world, people are aware of this place. And people are aware of this place because of this extremely unique cultural experience. You know, and part of just knowing each other allows us to organize in unique ways. Approaching Walter for this book, you know, I met Walter in 2010, and 7 years later, I happened unexpectedly to start teaching one of his grandchildren's music lessons. And I didn't realize it was his grandchild until I drew some connections. And then I built a relationship with one of his sons, Raymond, aka Boots. And the fact that I've had the extraordinary opportunity to build unique relationships with 3 generations of this family, and not even through one connection, like in 3 separate areas, I think represents something about what it means to be from an incredibly culturally unique place, that it's hard to put into words. I absolutely hear what Walter has to say, but I think this is a unique local cultural framework that allows for a different type of movement building, and has for a very long time.
Yeah, I would say that the idea of Oakland being something like a commune is possible. There are so many political organizations here. There's so many people that are in motion, and there's so much history of struggle against racism, against governmental controls and powers that undermine our liberation and our freedom, and undermine our economic uh, lives. That when people organize around it and pull together the solidarity that's necessary, given that we are also part of the crossroads of South America, Central America, and North America, that people are here from the East, Far East, Middle East, Europe. People here in large numbers consider themselves revolutionaries. Everybody who runs for office considers and will often announce that they're progressives. And when people say they are not a progressive, they generally don't get elected here in Oakland. And Oakland has an impact on the world, and people are aware of that. What people are doing in Nigeria with the pipelines has, in many ways, who had heard people make conversations about having seen things in Oakland. Um, when people were talking about doing demonstrations in London, they also had some connections to Oakland. So all of these mass activities have some impact. In 1998, I went to South Africa, and people who are heroes in my estimate from the South African anti-apartheid struggle talked about they had seen what was going on in Oakland in the 60s and 68 in the Panthers in the early 70s, and they were inspired to put themselves on the line. I mean, it was surprising that we do meet a need, you know. It's also used by the commercial establishments. The Oakland Raiders makes its money on the aftermarket, and it's all about Oakland. The images that come out of that is Oakland. That's true to some aspects of the music industry and so forth. And it's not coming back to the people necessarily, but it's a sense, a tribute to the power of movement and organizing and efforts here with our history. If we were to develop and learn from our struggles some more, we could begin to take command of a lot of the activities. Some of that requires electoral struggles. More of it requires being committed to fundamental change on the streets. I think I have said, and other people I take from say that there has been no change in the world without the ability of people to defend themselves from violence. And defending yourself from violence means that you have to engage in fighting sometimes. And that's one point for argument. There are a lot of folks that say India got its independence by nonviolence, but the fact is there was a very large and very powerful violent movement that made it impossible for the British to continue their rule. And that's, the story and the narrative gets done by someone else. The changes that have been made in South Africa certainly wasn't that. So our narratives can continue. We're constantly fighting around our narratives, as we have to always do it in academia. But in Oakland, we have to be ready to move. Minneapolis is an example. The power of large numbers of people moving. It's also an example of not having clear enough organizations. While there was a lot of organizational community among folks, there were many different organizations, but disparate organizations. Not enough political cohesion around what the change had to be. Stop the violence is absolutely important. Stop the police power is absolutely important, but we have to do something more, because if we make our fight against the police and the police only, it doesn't get to changing the structure of the system that we live in. We have to move further, and that's part of the discussion. I think we are perhaps in a place. Maybe is that what Paris was in the first commune or the second commune? I don't know, but there's a lot of political activity that is similar to what's happening in other places in the world at times when there was great moments. The opportunity is here for a fundamental change, not because we want to be out demonstrating, not because we want to become folks carrying a flag, and not because we want to be remembered, but because it is absolutely necessary for us to fundamentally change the systems that determine our lives, both economically, politically, making the laws and controlling the economics. This system is not capable of dealing with the climate issues that exist. It will not and cannot and will lead to the destruction. It cannot deal with the supremacy issues that exist, cannot deal with the distribution of food, water, and medicine that is absolutely critical for survival of vast numbers of people. And it only can continue to exist when a small number of people can have control for their own benefit, and masses of people, 90% of the people, are going to suffer here and around the world. And when people are aware of that, as all of you are, and those in the audience, then let's figure out how we come together to developing something more, something different, what that can be.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue to one of the questions from the audience. And I'll just read it. It seems like one of the biggest struggles for rights in this period is the attacks on immigrants in this country, which is obviously connected to the rise of mass incarceration and the policies of Black communities, policing of Black communities. Do you see any lessons that the movement against ICE can stand to learn from the civil rights struggles of the past? And I just extend it to any other struggles that you know from the past.
Um, I hesitate to say to learn from the civil rights struggles of the past or any other struggles. Certainly, there are things to be gleaned, but what we might know more of, not so much in terms of example, but some of the achievements. What we can learn from those movements is that we need to have a broader approach to working with each other. The civil rights movement was in a place that got a lot of publicity at the right time. It could have been broader, could have had more of a class conscious approach. It would have been better if there hadn't been a program in the civil rights movement getting rid of the leftists. Uh, could have been better. The anti-ICE movement, the pro-immigrant movement, the migrant workers organizing, trade unions, both in and community organizing, needs to get also be develop an awareness how we come together and work together. Uh, it's difficult to say when we're not in that group, uh, but the groups still work too much in their own silos. There are lots of folks, even in the Bay Area, who will be involved in the anti-ICE demonstration. We are preparing across all kinds of organizational lines for when ICE comes into the community and how we'll fight back um, against ICE. But organizationally, we're not developing these broader issues together. We still have the ICE organizations and the leading work stopping the shipping of militias out of the airport. Um, they are organizational efforts by particular groups and with particular approaches. But it's not like we got a class fight we're going here. We got to fight against a big enemy. whatever we call it. And we got to come together in massive approaches. And it doesn't mean we have 10,000 people every time we come together, but it means we have a sense that we're fighting against a system and not just our identity issue at this particular moment. And I think that's the drawback right now. I know it's hard. It's hard for me to say that at this point. I'm hoping that we are able to engage with folks in this discussion around that. I know that one example of dealing with these issues around immigrants and on campuses has been that the campus organizations representing the particular immigrant groups move people and bring people, and people are involved. They often are not involved in community issues. There's a separation. Um, there's some particular things we have to fight. Uh, I'll say it. I mean, there was a movement by various forces in Oakland to attack black folk and saying that black folk were creating this anti-Asian violence. And it's hard to say in terms of actual numbers whether or not there was more than ever before. But when you start the publicity, it certainly becomes something that becomes recognized. And it was necessary and could have been a moment for Asian revolutionaries to take a big role in making this fight. And some of that was done. But I can say that I talked to some folks and who said it was too difficult with the Asian community. And that's impossible to build a movement around when you don't take your responsibility for leadership or accountability in that issue. And how do you have that discussion when you're trying to get that done? I'm open to having that pushback here or wherever it's possible, but Oakland, with all of its potential, still has a lot of organizations working in their own little areas and building their own bailiwicks and their own jurisdictions that some overlap, but primarily still separate kind of approaches. And that's a problem internationally. It's certainly a problem locally.
Did you want to add to that, Jesse?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, when I think about lessons that the movement against ICE can stand to learn from other struggles of the past, I really am thinking a lot about abolitionist movements and the movement for abolition that, of course, we uh, look directly back to the abolitionist movement against the system of enslavement in this country, that has a direct line connection to the creation of the systems of policing. And more recently, in the 2020 uprisings after the police killing of George Floyd, kind of a different kind of discourse and a more popular discourse that we have built around abolition, which sometimes lacks depth, but also allows a possibility for people to think differently and think about a world that doesn't rely on policing. I think it also encourages communities to take responsibility for ourselves. Um, and that's something that also extends back to those more historical and more recent abolitionist movements. If we're thinking about the Underground Railroad and people organizing to hide their community members in order to find some version of freedom and access. Those are things that I think we need to be very aware of as we have new systems of law enforcement that are coming in to kidnap and steal and take away our community members. Um, and I'll also say in my professional workplace at a community center in Berkeley, the abolition movement that became more popularized, or the narrative around it out of the 2020 uprising, gave us the ability to build a police avoidance policy within that community center that also gives us, we've prioritized giving de-escalation training and resources to our staff so that we can do our best to address conflicts in our space. But even having that framework there allowed us to create an ICE exclusion policy. And I think these, when we're talking about different types of law enforcement and different types of like what it means to be identified as a valid person or not, and how law enforcement can attack that in our communities, I think these movements have a lot to say about each other.
Right.
I
No,
want to
that's,
add,
go
Robin,
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
that when we talk about the movements, particularly the movement around migrant and immigrants, that the questions of electoral politics becomes paramount. We saw it in the presidential election, and we see it in the local elections, see what the focuses are on organizing. And it has to be done, considered, learn from those things. But it's important to have a sense that the movement that to change the way the U.S. deals with migrants, deals with immigrants, has to be a way of looking at a system change. And to the extent we're engaged in movements that looking for certain kinds of reforms, we're not necessarily building the kind of solidarity with the groups, the movements, the activities, or the needs for more fundamental changes. So what we learned in the civil rights movement is that we could get certain things with new people getting to office and making some change. And once they are in office, they are a part of the system. And unless that movement is strong and continues, the system survives, whether it's a small aspect of the system or a big aspect of the system in terms of policies. And it always comes back to kick us in the butt, as we are seeing right now, historically. So that there has to be something more than trying to become a part of a system that allows us in. And it's part of the discussion around civil rights and structural changes, that when we were fighting for structural change, we began to see that the aspects of solidarity by the nature of existence becomes something different from integration. And I challenge the whole idea that we are talking about integration in the civil rights movement. It's structural attacks, structural changes. And that has to be a part of the movement for overcoming the racism around immigrants, the racism around the nations, countries that the immigrants are coming from, and about the role of immigrants in our society. Not to come here and become just part of the system, which is possible. Black folk have seen that's possible for every group that's come into the United States, and it's still, Black folk are still at the bottom, and by and large. And we have to see that when we fight together, we need to try and develop strategies for winning and knowing what those winnings are together, and not just making it easier in some ways. Lots of movement has to be developed to end ICE in our communities, and I think they are at this point not ready to come into Oakland because of the challenges they would have with all of our community organizing. And if they did, in some ways, we'd be able to repel them in similar ways that maybe they didn't see in Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
But also,
Right.
Jesse and I talked some about who likes politics, and Jesse thinks I'm an election reformer, and he's a revolutionary in the streets. Just because he's younger, and but I think that both are necessary. I also think that it's important to build movement through electoral struggles, and to constantly hold their feet to the fire of those who are elected, and not just leave them there to be political thinkers for us, but that organized efforts and organizations maintaining itself is important. And then maybe there has to be international organization and unified organization, and there has to be cadre organizations. There had to be movement of the people. There has to be a movement of the people in the streets prepared to defend themselves from every possible kind of attack as we move forward. Diversity of tactics become absolutely essential.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to bring us to a close. A couple things just in closing. One, it's really important in terms of movement building to support political education. And so I encourage people to give money to the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction. You can go on the website, hit donate, and because Gio's right here, you know. Secondly, there's so many lessons in this amazing book, Civil Rights and Structural Attacks. We barely scratched the surface. So if you want to know more, the actual pub date, I think, is the 23rd, right? June 23rd. You can, and this is a great Father's Day gift. It's a great Juneteenth gift. It's a great, you know, 250th anniversary of settler colonial US. You can get this book. Make sure you give it to as many people as possible, because it is not just a memoir, it is a set of lessons. And if we're going to build the kind of mass movement that Walter is insisting that correctly that we need to build, you can't do it without this book. So with that, I want to thank all of you. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Gio. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Haymarket. This is an extraordinary book, an extraordinary day. And thank you for the time. And hopefully everyone else have a great day today, on Father's Day, and on the day that you should be reading this book.
Thank you.
So I will see everybody.